Philip Dean Hancock's case shocked the nation, a chilling tale of violence, tragedy, and justice. Convicted of brutally murdering two individuals, his crimes left a lasting impact on the lives of many. In this video, we'll explore the details of the case, the evidence that sealed his fate, and the ultimate sentence he faced for his actions. Let's dive into the story of Philip Dean Hancock. In 2001, the quiet stability of Oklahoma City was shattered by a chilling double homicide that left the community in disbelief and mourning. The crime involved Philip Dean Hancock, a man who would later claim self-defense as the motive for his actions. The victims, Robert Lee Jett Jr. and James Vincent Lynch III, were well known in their circles, and their tragic deaths sent ripples through the lives of everyone who knew them. What initially appeared to be a senseless act of violence soon unfolded into a case filled with complex details, raising questions about motive, intent, and justice. The incident occurred during a late-night encounter at a residence in Oklahoma City, where Hancock met Jett and Lynch. Accounts of the evening are murky, and much of the case relied on the narrative provided by Hancock himself, as well as the evidence uncovered by investigators. According to Hancock, the interaction turned violent after an alleged confrontation in which he claimed the two men became aggressive toward him. He described a scenario in which he felt cornered and under threat, leading to a deadly escalation that he argued was his only means of self-defense. However, the aftermath of the crime told a different story. Both victims were shot multiple times, and the nature of their injuries suggested a deliberate act rather than a spontaneous reaction to danger. Investigators were quick to note inconsistencies in Hancock's account. While he claimed that Jett and Lynch had physically attacked him, forensic evidence did not align with this version of events. The pattern of gunfire, the positioning of the bodies, and other clues at the scene raised doubts about Hancock's claims of self-preservation. As the investigation continued, more troubling details emerged about Hancock's background and behavior. He had a criminal history, including a conviction for manslaughter nearly 2 decades prior. This past incident cast a shadow over his claims of acting in self-defense, suggesting a possible predisposition to violence rather than a one-off act of survival. The community, already reeling from the loss of 2 lives, grappled with the disturbing possibility that the killings were premeditated. The personal lives of the victims also came under scrutiny. Robert Lee Jett Jr. was described as a hardworking and kind-hearted individual, while James Vincent Lynch III was remembered for his vibrant personality and deep connections within the community. Both men were loved by their families and friends, and their sudden deaths left a void that could not be filled. The grief of their loved ones was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the motives and circumstances of the crime. Witnesses and acquaintances of all 3 men were brought in for questioning, adding more layers to an already convoluted case. Some described prior tensions between Hancock and the victims, suggesting that the encounter might not have been as random as initially believed. Others painted a picture of Hancock as a man prone to paranoia and aggression, further challenging his assertions of acting in fear for his life. As these details surfaced, the case grew increasingly complex, both in the court of public opinion and in the official investigation. The Oklahoma City Police Department worked tirelessly to gather evidence, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. They analyzed the ballistic evidence, combed through the crime scene for physical traces, and interviewed anyone who might shed light on what truly transpired that fateful night. The double murder not only devastated the victims' families but also sent shockwaves throughout the community. For many, it was a harsh reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of violence. Candlelight vigils were held to honor Jett and Lynch, drawing crowds of mourners who shared stories, tears, and calls for justice. As the investigation concluded and the case proceeded to trial, the events of that night in 2001 became etched in the collective memory of Oklahoma City. The chilling details of the crime, the lives lost, and the unanswered questions set the stage for a trial that would attempt to unravel the truth behind Philip Dean Hancock's actions. The investigation into the murders of Robert Lee Jett Jr. and James Vincent Lynch III began almost immediately after law enforcement arrived at the crime scene. The Oklahoma City Police Department found themselves confronted with a grim and puzzling tableau. 2 men were dead, and the suspect, Philip Dean Hancock, was at the center of the mystery. Determining what had occurred and why became the priority for investigators as they pieced together the events of the night. The crime scene was critical in the early stages of the investigation. Jett and Lynch were found inside the residence, their bodies showing signs of multiple gunshot wounds. The positioning of the victims and the physical evidence in the room raised immediate questions about the suspect's account of self-defense. Detectives carefully documented the scene, photographing the bodies, blood splatter patterns, and any objects that might provide insight into the confrontation. They also collected bullet casings and fragments for ballistic analysis, which would later play a significant role in the case. Hancock, who had not fled the scene, was taken into custody and interviewed by police. From the outset, his demeanor was scrutinized. He claimed he had acted in self-defense after Jett and Lynch allegedly attacked him, but investigators noted inconsistencies in his story. Hancock described the confrontation as chaotic and violent, yet his appearance showed no significant injuries or evidence of a struggle. This disparity immediately cast doubt on his version of events. As detectives delved deeper, they began reconstructing the timeline leading up to the murders. Witness interviews were a crucial part of this process. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots late in the evening, followed by a tense silence. Some described hearing what they thought were raised voices earlier in the night, suggesting an argument might have preceded the violence. Investigators also reached out to individuals who had interacted with Jett, Lynch, and Hancock in the days and weeks prior to the incident, hoping to uncover any conflicts or connections that might explain the tragic outcome. Forensic evidence became a cornerstone of the investigation. The bullet trajectories and entry wounds on the victims' bodies indicated that they were shot from close range, but the positioning suggested they may not have been attacking Hancock at the time. Blood spatter analysis further supported this theory, contradicting Hancock's claims that he was acting defensively against two men actively assaulting him. These findings were pivotal as they began to paint a picture of a deliberate act rather than a spontaneous reaction to danger. Hancock's firearm was also a key piece of evidence. Investigators analyzed the weapon to determine whether it had been fired recently and to match it to the bullet casings found at the scene. Ballistic experts confirmed that the casings were consistent with rounds fired from Hancock's gun, leaving little doubt about the weapon used in the killings. Additionally, the number of shots fired raised questions about Hancock's intent. The fact that both victims had multiple gunshot wounds suggested a level of overkill inconsistent with a panicked act of self-defense. Detectives also examined Hancock's personal history for any clues that might shed light on his actions. His criminal record revealed a manslaughter conviction from the 1980s, a detail that would later prove significant during his trial. This past incident hinted at a propensity for violence, undermining his credibility as someone who acted purely out of fear. Furthermore, interviews with acquaintances and neighbors portrayed Hancock as a man with a volatile temperament, prone to anger and paranoia. These character traits began to shape the narrative that investigators would eventually present in court. Meanwhile, the lives of the victims were also explored to understand the full context of the crime. Jett and Lynch were described by their families as kind and caring individuals with no history of violence. Their loved ones vehemently rejected the notion that they would have provoked such a violent confrontation. This perspective added emotional weight to the investigation, as detectives worked not only to uncover the truth but also to provide closure for grieving families. In the weeks following the murders, investigators compiled a substantial body of evidence against Hancock. His account of the incident was thoroughly discredited by the forensic findings, and his past criminal history cast further doubt on his claims. By the time the case was ready to be presented to the district attorney, the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Hancock's guilt. Hancock was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the community braced itself for a trial that promised to be both harrowing and highly publicized. The investigation had been meticulous, leaving no room for doubt about the circumstances of the crime. Detectives had succeeded in their mission to uncover the truth, setting the stage for a courtroom battle that would determine Hancock's fate. The trial of Phillip Dean Hancock for the murders of Robert Lee Jett Jr. and James Vincent Lynch III was a highly anticipated event that gripped the community and drew significant media attention. It was not merely a legal proceeding but a moral reckoning, as the court was tasked with unraveling the complex events of that fateful night and determining whether Hancock's actions were justified or a cold-blooded crime. The prosecution and defense both prepared extensively, knowing that the stakes could not be higher. Hancock faced the death penalty if convicted. From the outset, the prosecution's case was built on a foundation of forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts, meticulously pieced together during the investigation. They argued that Hancock's actions were premeditated and deliberate, pointing to the pattern of gunshot wounds, the positioning of the victims, and the lack of physical evidence supporting his claims of self-defense. The prosecutor described the crime as a calculated act of violence, asserting that Hancock had no reasonable cause to believe his life was in danger. Instead, they suggested he acted out of anger or a personal grudge against Jett and Lynch. The prosecution presented ballistic evidence that tied Hancock's firearm to the killings, establishing beyond doubt that the weapon used in the crime belonged to him. They also brought in forensic experts to testify about the trajectory of the bullets and the placement of the bodies, emphasizing that the victims appeared to have been shot while in positions inconsistent with an active attack. Blood spatter analysis further undermined Hancock's narrative, as it suggested that at least one of the victims was stationary or retreating when they were shot. Another key aspect of the prosecution's case was Hancock's criminal history. While the defense attempted to exclude his prior manslaughter conviction from the trial, the judge ultimately allowed it to be introduced as evidence, given its relevance to his character and propensity for violence. The prosecution used this prior conviction to argue that Hancock had a pattern of resorting to deadly force inappropriately, framing him as a man with a history of lethal impulsivity. The victims' families also played a poignant role in the trial, providing emotional testimony about the devastating impact of the murders. They described Jett and Lynch as kind, nonviolent individuals, painting a stark contrast to the narrative Hancock tried to present. Their tearful accounts served as a reminder of the human cost of the crime, keeping the focus on the lives lost and the justice they deserved. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. Their primary argument centered on Hancock's claim of self-defense, a narrative that had been their strategy since the beginning. They painted Jett and Lynch as aggressors who had threatened and attacked Hancock, leaving him no choice but to defend himself. Hancock's legal team argued that their client acted out of fear for his life, not malice, and that the chaotic nature of the incident made forensic evidence inconclusive. Hancock himself took the stand during the trial, a risky move that could either bolster his defense or unravel it entirely. He recounted the events of the night with vivid detail, portraying himself as a man caught in a terrifying situation. He claimed that Jett and Lynch had become hostile during their interaction, attempting to physically assault him and making him fear for his safety. Hancock's testimony was emotional and at times erratic, which drew sympathy from some observers but skepticism from others. The defense also attempted to highlight inconsistencies in the investigation, suggesting that law enforcement had prematurely focused on Hancock as the sole suspect. They questioned the thoroughness of the forensic analysis and suggested that certain aspects of the crime scene might have been misinterpreted. While these arguments introduced a degree of doubt, they ultimately struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting narratives. The prosecution hammered home the implausibility of Hancock's self-defense claim, pointing out that he had no visible injuries and that the evidence contradicted his version of events. The defense, in turn, tried to humanize Hancock and emphasize the unpredictability of violent encounters, urging the jury to consider the possibility of reasonable fear and split-second decision-making. The closing arguments were impassioned. The prosecution called on the jury to deliver justice for Jett and Lynch, emphasizing the cold and calculated nature of the crime. They argued that Hancock's actions were not the result of fear but of deliberate intent to kill. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for understanding and leniency, portraying Hancock as a flawed but frightened man who acted in desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was tense as the foreperson read the decision, and the families of the victims wept openly. The conviction was a significant moment, providing a sense of closure for those who had lost their loved ones. though it could never truly heal the wounds left behind. The sentencing phase of the trial followed, during which the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, citing the brutality of the crime and Hancock's previous criminal record. The defense argued for life imprisonment without parole, emphasizing Hancock's age and the potential for remorse. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution, recommending the death penalty. The trial of Phillip Dean Hancock was a somber reminder of the gravity of justice and the profound impact of violent crime. It concluded with a definitive statement from the court, but the pain and loss endured by the victims' families and the community would remain long after the final gavel fell. After Phillip Dean Hancock was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the next phase of the legal process was the sentencing hearing, where the question of what punishment Hancock would face was put before the jury. Given the brutal nature of the crime and Hancock's prior criminal history, the prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that this was the appropriate punishment for the heinous acts he had committed. For the victims' families, this phase was not only about seeking justice for their loved ones, but also about confronting the magnitude of what had occurred and deciding whether the ultimate penalty should be applied. The death penalty is a contentious issue, and the sentencing phase of a capital murder trial is often an emotionally charged and difficult proceeding for everyone involved. It is a time when the courtroom becomes a forum for reflection on the impact of the crime, the character of the defendant, and the broader moral questions surrounding capital punishment. For the prosecution, this was a critical moment to underscore the brutality of the murders and argue that Hancock's actions were so violent and unprovoked that the only fitting consequence was death. The prosecution's case for the death penalty focused on the cold-blooded nature of the murders. They emphasized that Hancock had shot both victims multiple times, showing a clear intention to kill and no regard for their lives. The victims, Jett and Lynch, were unarmed, and there was no evidence that they had posed any imminent threat to Hancock. The prosecution also pointed to Hancock's criminal history, particularly his prior conviction for manslaughter, suggesting that he had a pattern of violent behavior and lacked the capacity for reform. His actions on the night of the murders, they argued, were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but of a calculated decision to take 2 lives. In their quest for the death penalty, the prosecution called upon experts in criminology and psychology to testify about the danger Hancock posed to society. They described him as a man who had demonstrated an inability to control his violent impulses, pointing to his past run-ins with the law as evidence of his dangerous tendencies. Hancock's lack of remorse was also highlighted, with the prosecution arguing that he showed no empathy for the victims or their families. His failure to express sorrow or guilt for his actions further painted him as someone who was deserving of the most severe punishment. On the other side, the defense team worked to humanize Hancock, hoping to convince the jury that he was not beyond redemption and that life imprisonment, rather than execution, would be a more appropriate punishment. The defense argued that Hancock's life had been marked by a series of tragic events, including a difficult upbringing and mental health issues that may have contributed to his violent tendencies. They called upon psychologists and family members to testify about his troubled childhood, hoping to present him as a man shaped by circumstances beyond his control. The defense suggested that Hancock's history of violence was a result of trauma and a lack of proper support, and they pleaded for a sentence that would allow him to receive the treatment and rehabilitation he needed. In a particularly emotional moment, Hancock's family members testified on his behalf, speaking about the man they knew and expressing their belief that he could change if given the chance. They described him as someone who had been affected by hardship and who, despite his actions, still deserved a chance at redemption. The defense team also highlighted the fact that Hancock had no significant criminal record after his previous conviction, arguing that he had not engaged in violent behavior for many years and that the crime in question was an isolated incident. However, the victims' families were equally vocal, and their testimony played a pivotal role in the proceedings. Robert Lee Jett Jr. and James Vincent Lynch III had been beloved members of their communities, and their families spoke powerfully about the loss they had suffered. Their grief was palpable as they described the emotional toll the murders had taken on their lives. The victims' families emphasized that while they understood the complexities of Hancock's background, They could never forgive what he had done. They spoke of the need for justice, not just for their loved ones, but for the community as a whole, which had been scarred by the senseless deaths. As the defense and prosecution made their final arguments, the jury was tasked with determining whether Hancock should live or die. It was a decision that required careful consideration of the evidence, the nature of the crime, and the broader societal implications of capital punishment. Would they apply the death penalty to a man with a troubled past, or would they opt for life in prison as a more humane alternative? The stakes could not have been higher, as the jury's decision would ultimately shape the course of Hancock's future and close a painful chapter for the victims' families. After a lengthy deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. They had decided to sentence Hancock to death. The decision was met with mixed emotions. While the victims' families expressed a sense of relief and closure, there was also a somber acknowledgement that no punishment could truly bring their loved ones back. For Hancock, the sentence was the culmination of a long and tragic journey, one that had begun with the deaths of two innocent men and now ended with his own life hanging in the balance. The death penalty sentence set the stage for the final phase of the legal process, the appeals. While Hancock's defense team filed various motions to challenge the conviction and sentence, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and issues related to the fairness of the trial, the process that followed would be lengthy and fraught with legal complexities. But for the victims' families, the focus was on the closure that the sentence provided and the knowledge that justice had, in their view, been served. Hancock's sentencing to death was a powerful moment, a reminder of the irrevocable nature of the crimes he had committed. It was a decision that reverberated beyond the courtroom, touching the lives of many and raising difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the value of human life. As the case continued to wind its way through the appeals process, the impact of the death penalty sentence would be felt for years to come, as the families of Jett and Lynch struggled to come to terms with the loss they had endured and the legal processes that would ultimately define the legacy of the case. The execution of Phillip Hancock, which took place in 2023, marked the final chapter in a case that had captured national attention. After more than 2 decades of legal proceedings, appeals, and courtroom battles, Hancock's death sentence was carried out by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. For the victims' families, the long wait for justice was over, but the emotions surrounding Hancock's execution were mixed. The closure they had long sought was finally within reach, but it came at the cost of reflecting on the brutal loss of their loved ones. For others, the execution raised complex questions about the morality of the death penalty and the broader implications of state-sanctioned killing. Hancock's execution was the culmination of a long and arduous legal process. After his conviction and sentencing, Hancock's defense team had filed numerous appeals, each one seeking to overturn the conviction or sentence on various legal grounds. These appeals ranged from claims of ineffective legal representation during the trial to arguments regarding the fairness of the sentencing process. The appeals stretched on for years, delaying the inevitable and prolonging the emotional and psychological toll on all involved. Despite the defense's best efforts, the courts ultimately upheld Hancock's conviction and death sentence. His execution date was set, and as it neared, the media began to take renewed interest in the case, revisiting the details of the murders and the lengthy legal battle that followed. The media coverage was extensive, with some outlets focusing on the victims' families, while others delved into the complexities of the case and the legal arguments surrounding the death penalty. In the days leading up to the execution, Hancock's case drew significant attention from both supporters and opponents of the death penalty. Advocacy groups and legal experts made public appeals for clemency, arguing that Hancock's troubled upbringing, mental health issues, and past trauma should be taken into consideration. They pointed to his background of abuse, struggles with addiction, and previous encounters with the criminal justice system as mitigating factors that could warrant a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death. Hancock himself also spoke out in the days before the execution, offering a series of statements that reflected his complex emotions in the final hours of his life. He expressed remorse for his actions, apologizing to the families of Jett and Lynch for the pain he had caused. His statements were seen by some as a sign of genuine contrition, while others questioned whether his remorse was sincere or motivated by fear of his impending death. Regardless of the validity of his apologies, the families of the victims remained resolute in their belief that justice had to be served. They had spent years fighting for closure and believed that Hancock's execution was the necessary final step in the process. On the day of the execution, a group of reporters, legal observers, and family members gathered at the prison. The atmosphere was tense as all waited for the final moments of Hancock's life. Inside the prison, the execution was carried out according to Oklahoma's protocols for lethal injections. Hancock was strapped to a gurney, and the process began. The lethal injection was administered, and within minutes, Hancock was pronounced dead. His life, which had been marked by violence, loss, and legal battles, came to a quiet end in the sterile environment of the state penitentiary. The execution was not only a legal event, but a deeply emotional one for those who had been affected by the murders. The victims' families were present to witness the final moments of the man who had taken their loved ones' lives. For them, the execution was the end of a painful chapter. They had lived with the trauma of the murders for over 2 decades, and while no punishment could ever bring back their loved ones, there was a sense of finality in the execution. The justice they had longed for had been served. However, the family's grief did not simply disappear with the execution. The emotional scars left by the murders of Jett and Lynch were deep, and even as Hancock was put to death, the families continued to grapple with their loss. For some, there was no sense of relief or peace. The emotional toll of losing a loved one to violence can never be fully overcome, and even the most severe punishment could not erase the years of pain that had followed the murders. For those who had advocated against the death penalty, Hancock's execution was a somber reminder of the complexities of the issue. The death penalty, a punishment that has long been a point of contention in American society, raised difficult moral and ethical questions. Was Hancock's execution truly just, or was it an irreversible decision made in the heat of anger and revenge? Many opponents of the death penalty pointed out the inherent flaws in the system, from the risk of wrongful convictions to the racial and socioeconomic disparities that exist within the justice system. They saw Hancock's death as a tragic consequence of a flawed system that does not always deliver fair or consistent outcomes. Meanwhile, supporters of the death penalty celebrated Hancock's execution as the final step in ensuring that he faced the full consequences of his crimes. They argued that his brutal actions had left no room for mercy, and that justice for the victims required Hancock to pay the ultimate price. For them, the execution was not about revenge, but about protecting society and ensuring that individuals who commit such violent acts do not have the chance to harm others in the future. In the wake of Hancock's execution, the legal and moral debates continued. Advocates on both sides of the issue expressed their views, but for those closest to the case, the families of Jett and Lynch, there was a sense of finality, even if it did little to heal their wounds. The years of legal proceedings, the emotional turmoil, and the constant weighing of life and death had reached their conclusion. Yet the memories of the 2 men who had been senselessly murdered would never be erased. For the victims' families, the focus turned to preserving the legacies of Jett and Lynch. Their loved ones would continue to honor their memories, sharing stories of their kindness, their contributions to their communities, and the joy they had brought into the lives of those around them. Even as the legal process came to an end, their lives remained a testament to the love and connection they had fostered, and their families were determined to ensure that their memory would never fade. Hancock's execution marked the end of a long and painful journey, not only for him but for all those affected by his actions. The legal battles were over, the punishment was delivered, and the case was closed. Yet the emotional and philosophical questions raised by the death penalty lingered, as they always do, in the hearts and minds of those who have witnessed its consequences.